Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are on Daf Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph, on the bottom of the page, 21a. The learning of Amud Yomi this month has been sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. Navid Bayanfar for the Shlomo of Shefa Bat Nechama, and for the health and happiness of the children, the Fa'ela Miriam Bat Tzipora, Chana Bat Tzipora, Emunah Rachel Bat Tzipora, and Sufia Sarah Bat Tzipora. So much nahat from them. Amen. So we are in the middle of discussion of whether or not a person that has davened and now remembers that he has davened would be allowed to daven again. So we had yesterday the first member of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. If you take a look at the first wide line at the end by two dots, the Gemara said, Ve'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Haya omed bitfilah v'nizkar shehitpalel. If you are in the middle of tfilah and you remember, oops, I already davened mincha, then you have to stop. Says the Gemara, posek v'afilu be'emsa bracha. You stop, though be it. Thank you so much. You're in the middle of the bracha, you just have to stop. So now the Gemara says, a second member in the name of Shmuel. Take a look at 3 lines up by 2 dots. Says the Gemara, Ve'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Another teaching of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Hitpalel v'nichnas lebet knesset. If you davened already beyachid at home, and now you go to the shul, and you find that the tzibur is davening, can you daven with them or can you not daven with them? So says the Gemara, Im yachol lechadesh badavar, yachzor ve'itpalel. If you could go back and daven a new tefillah, that means you're going to ask from Hashem things you have not asked in your private tefillah. It's a new calling to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a new tefillah. Then you could daven a second tefillah with them. It's like a tefillat nedava, that you are opting for a new tefillah, but it is a new tefillah. That means you're asking now for things that you didn't ask 10 minutes ago in your regular Shemona Esrei. Then you have the allowance to go back and daven again. Ve'im lav, if you can't be mechadesh tavar, if you can't ask for a new thing, says the Gemara, al yachzor v'yitpalel. Then you should not go back and daven again. So why? Why do you need 2 members in the name of Shmuel? Shmuel once already told me that if you are in the middle of the bracha even, you should not go back and daven. You should stop. You can't daven if you have davened already. And now he's telling me essentially the same thing, that if you have davened, you can't daven again. So Shmuel has said this in 2 different formats and 2 different wordings, that if you have davened already, you cannot go back and daven again. Why the repetition? Why do you need Shmuel to say this twice? Says the Gemara. Both of these Shmuels are needed. They are Shmuel and Kamaita. If Shmuel would only teach me the first one, that means the case that you're in the middle of Shemona Esrei, davening in the smack in the middle of Tefillah, you remember you have davened already. Says the Gemara, Hanamidi Yachid v'Yachid or Sibur v'Sibur. I would have thought to myself that that's only when the first time that you davened was beyachid, and the second time that you davened also was beyachid. Both of them were beyachid. Both of them we're talking about a private tefillah, or both of them would be talking about tefillat tzibur. In other words, the first and second time in the same level of a tefillah. You davened alone, and you're davening alone again. At what point do you remember that, oops, I davened again, or I davened already? Or you daven b'tzibur, For instance, you had an early mincha minyan at 1:35, and then you come to the regular 7:30 minyan, and you're davening with the minyan, and you remember, today I actually did the early minyan. Both of them are the same level. In that case, Shmuel would say that you do not go back, you're not allowed to daven again. But who says maybe if the first time I davened b'yachid, and now I'm davening b'tzibur, maybe Shmuel would agree that tefillah b'tzibur is something very different than a tefillah b'yachid, and hence you should be allowed to do it. That's what I would have thought if you didn't have the second one. The second Mishnah, therefore, the second memra of Shmuel, therefore, says that not only yachid, tzibur, but even if you davened at home alone, and now you're coming to tzibur, you're not allowed to daven unless you could be mechadesh davar, unless you could bring something new into your tefillah. So that's why I need a second Shmuel. The first one alone would not be sufficient, because I would have thought maybe that's only Yachid and Yachid or Sibur and Sibur. But Yachid and Sibur in comparison with each other, Aval Yachid legabe Sibur, first line, Keman delot salidami. A tefillah alone at home versus now davening again with the Tzibur, I would have thought maybe Shmuel would say daven again, because your tefillah that you davened alone is as if it doesn't exist in front of tefillah b'tzibur. So therefore, you needed the second Shmuel to say that no, even if you davened alone at home, you should not daven even with the tzibur again. You did your mincha, you did your shahar, you did your chiyuv already. Okay, why can't I just have the second one? And if we would only say the second member of Shmuel, Mishum de lo atchil ba, I would say, what was the second member of Shmuel? Shmuel said, if you daven at home, then you come to shul and say, the tzibur is davening. Am I allowed to opt for a second tefillah? Says Shmuel, no. You're not allowed to opt for a second tefillah unless you are what? Mechadesh davar. So if I would only have that Shmuel, I would say, you know why you should not daven again? Because you're in the beginning of tefillah. You haven't started. You go to Chacham, you ask him, say, Chacham, should I daven again? Chacham will say no. But if you already are in the middle of Shema Kolenu, you already started the tefillah. You're smack in the middle of tefillah. I would have thought maybe Shmuel would say, continue and finish it up. You're already in the middle of tefillah. You're not opting for a new tefillah. I have davened already 12 brachot out of 18. I'm going to stop and just wash off everything I've done. I would have thought to myself, maybe Shmuel would agree that if you're smack in the middle of tefillah already, by mistake you started tefillah, you should already finish it. Therefore, kamash malan, that's not the halacha. I would have thought it's because you haven't started the tefillah yet. Aval hatam. But there, in the case that you're in the middle of tefillah and then you remember, oops, I davened it already. The atchilba, emalo, I would have thought maybe not. You shouldn't stop. You should just finish up the tefillah. Therefore, says the Gemara, you need both of them. Okay. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, hanichnas lebet knesset, umatza sibur shemitpalelim. If a person comes to shul basically late, and he finds that the tzibur already is davening, the tzibur is already davening, im yachol lehatchil veligmor ad shelo yagia shaliach tzibur lemodim, if he could start and finish his Shemona Esrei before the shaliach tzibur in the tefillah of Chazara gets to modim, then he should start with the tzibur. Ve'im lav alit palel. And if not, he should not daven. Why? Says Rashi, because the tefillah of modim, everyone bows in the tefillah of modim, And if this guy is not bowing, it looks like he's kofer b'mishe hatzibur mishtachavim lo. It looks like he is denying the service of the one that everyone else is bowing to. So therefore, it looks like he doesn't agree with Hashem. He's not modeh to Hashem. So therefore, it's not good. Now, the Rabbeinu Tam, the Tosafot over here on the side, they bring, there's a long Tosafot, that the Rabbeinu Tam used to, when he was davening a longer Shemona Esrei, when people would bow, he would also bow without saying any words, in order not to look like he's not modeh to the one that people are bowing to. So why that would not just be an idea, we have to discuss. But nevertheless, says the Gemara, if you could start and quickly finish before the Shaliach Tzibur gets to Modim, then yitpalel, then you should daven. Ve'im lav, but if you can't, al yitpalel, you should not daven. You should not start the Tzibur until they started maybe together with you, and you go with the Shaliach Tzibur for the rest of the Tefillah. That's an option as well. Now, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees with that. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "Im yachol la'atchil ve'ligmor at shelo yagia Shaliach Tzibur likdusha yitpalel." Not only modim, but you have to be able to start and finish before Shaliach Tzibur gets to nakdishach. So says the Gemara, ve'im lav. If you can't be so fast as to finishing before nakdishach, alit palen. You should not start it now. Wait until you start with the Shaliach Tzibur, baby, and say the whole thing together. So, b'may kamifli, what is the machloket exactly? Says the Gemara. Says the Gemara, more savar yachid omer kedusha, umor savar en yachid omer kedusha. The way the Rashba and the Ritba understand this Gemara is that the first Mandamar holds that when the Yachid davens alone, even not even in the Tzibur, they could say Kedusha. In other words, he's not davening with the Tzibur together, but he is amongst a Tzibur. He's not davening at the same pace with the Tzibur, but he is with a Tzibur. He asked me, you could daven, and he could say even Nakdishach in his own private tefillah. The Tzibur is not saying Nakdishach, and he knows that he's going to be late. So he davens, he gets to Akel HaKadosh, he gets to, the bracha before Ata HaKadosh, and he says Nakdishach v'na'arisach, he says the entire Nakdishach alone, because he's amongst the Tzibur. And the other Mandam, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, holds that no, if you're not with the Tzibur, actually, you could not say Nakdishach. Now, there are other Rishonim who understand the first Shita in the Gemara, that a Yachid, mamash a Yachid. That means even if you're davening alone, you could say Nakdishach as part of your tefillah. Now, the Gemara says,
in that order we say it, or like for the first case that Rabbi mentioned, where the individual says it on his own, is that where the individual reached Nakdisha, or when the tzibur is at Nakdisha? It doesn't matter.
Well, if you're in amongst the tzibur, you could say it. According to the Ritba and the Rashba's understanding, you are davening your own pace of tefillah.
You haven't finished yet.
You have not finished, and they are not where you're holding. So you could say in your own private tefillah, you could say when you get to Mechayeh Ametim, you could say Nakdishach.
Does it matter if they said it or not yet?
Amen.
We're not discussing halacha. We're gonna get actually to what the Gemara is going to disagree with. Says the Gemara, what's their machloket? More savar yachid omer kedusha, more savar and yachid omer kedusha. One of them holds that a yachid, an individual, cannot say kedusha, and the other one holds he could. Amar Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada bar Ava said, "Minayin she'en hayachid omer kedusha." How do I know? I prove it to you. How do I know that a Yachid cannot say Kedusha? Shenemar, as it says, V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. Hashem says, I will be sanctified betoch b'nei Yisrael, amongst b'nei Yisrael. Now, that's a very ambiguous language. What does that exactly mean? Amongst b'nei Yisrael, which seems to mean that I'm going to be sanctified amongst a number of people. Now, what is that number? 1,000, 5,000, 600,000, 6 million, 10, 5? What exactly means v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael? So says the Gemara, kol davar shebikdusha. When it says v'nikdashti, I will be sanctified, means kol davar shebikdusha, anything of sanctity, any davar shebikdusha, lo yehe pachot ma'asara, should not be less than a minyan, less than asara. How do I know the number 10, the magical number 10? My mashma, how in the world is v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael supposed to mean 10, right? It just says b'toch b'nei Yisrael. How do you know 10, the number 10? Says the Gemara. The Tani, as we learned, in the name of Rabbi, Achod Rab Chia bar Abba, the brother of Rab Chia bar Abba, Atzia toch toch. We learn it from a Gezerah Shabbat. 2 times the word toch, amongst, is mentioned, and 1 time, one of them is clearly indicating 10. So therefore, I learned the second one when it says toch, that also is referring to a number of 10. In other words, it says v'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. Hashem says, I will be sanctified betoch b'nei Yisrael, amongst b'nei Yisrael, which indicates a tzibur, indicates a multitude of people. But how many, it doesn't say. But it says toch, it says amongst. So we are taught that there is another time that the Chumash says toch, and there clearly is referring to 10 people. So K'tiv Hacha, over here it says, V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, I will be sanctified betoch b'nei Yisrael. Uchtiv Hatam, by the story of Meraglim, the spies that went to spy the land and came back, 12 of them were there. 2 of them, Kalev and Yehoshua, said positive, and the other 10 said negative. The 10 that were punished, they died. And about them, it says, "Hibadelu mitoch ha'edah hazot v'achale otam karaga." It says, separate yourself mitoch ha'edah hazot, from amongst this edah, this congregation. Who is he talking about? The Meraglim. How many of them were there that Hashem wanted to kill them? He says, separate yourself, I'm going to kill them in a moment. Right? So of course he's not talking about what? It's not talking about, now again, the pasuk here is talking about Korach. This pasuk is not talking about the Meraglim. This pasuk is talking about Adat Korach. How many Adat Korach? You had hundreds, right? You had Korach, you had Adato. I mean, it happened to be that not all of them died the way Korach died. Korach and Datan and Abiram and their wives and family, aside short of the Bnei Korach, they all were swallowed in the ground. And then the rest of the assembly of 250 people, they died with a magefa, with fire. But here it says Edah. The word Edah, congregation, which also we don't know what it means, is ambiguous, but it says mitoch. Now, the Edah, by Adat Korach is mentioned Edah, and by Meragelim, by the spies also is mentioned Edah. Male halan asara, afkan asara. Where is asara? By the Edah of the Meragelim. What does it say by the Edah of Meragelim? It says, Ad matai la'edah hara'a hazot. It says, until when I should tolerate this bad congregation. And he's referring to the 10 Merakelim. So you see, there's one stop over here in the middle of the Kal Vachomer. The Gemara says it in a short version. We got to go through it again. But outside, it's important to understand what's happening over here. We have a word mitoch, right? By toch, we learned it Gezerah Shabbat toch toch. Over here it says, "V'niktashti betoch bnei Yisrael." I will be sanctified amongst bnei Yisrael. We have to understand what this means because we don't know what number of people we necessarily need over here. So the Gemara says, okay, let's study this betoch. There is another time that it says betoch, and it says betoch ha'edah. Toch ha'edah. Edah is a congregation also, and it's mentioned by Adat Korach. And what does edah mean? I learned that from Meragelim, because it says Admatai la'edah hara. And which one? How many of the edah? The entirety of Meragelim were 12. How many of them were edah hara, the bad ones? 10. So you learn the edah of Adat Korach from the edah of Meragelim. So now you know that edah means 10, and you have edah with toch together, and you have a gezerah shava of toch toch. So therefore you know, Bnei Yisrael, a congregation is 10. And now that I know the congregation is 10, when it says, "V'niktashti betoch Bnei Yisrael," I know that it means that the minimum of 10 is needed for niktashti, for anything of sanctification. So anything that is an official sanctification of Hashem, naktishach, it's a group sanctification. We will sanctify your name, naktishach, or kaddish, right? Kaddish, kedusha, tefillah, all of those things that are functions of tzibur. We learn that the tzibur is 10. Now, it's a very interesting tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. That Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva is used by many. Whether or not you could count non-frum people in a minyan, right? There are many who say, well, if you are not Shomer Shabbat, you're not Jewish, right? The Gemara says, if you are not modeh to Shabbat, you're kofer b'kol Torah kula, so therefore you have forfeited your entirety of the rights to being a Jew, and therefore you're not counted as a minyan.
Literally, or
it means as literal as possible. They mean it. But now the question is, who is considered Shomer Shabbat and who is not considered Shomer Shabbat? In other words, you have a person that is Tinok Shenishban. The majority of the people nowadays are not Shomer Shabbat not because they hate Hashem, it's because they never learned any better, right? Their parents wanted to give them a great Jewish education, and out of ignorance, they sent them to Sinai. So they sent them to schools that are worse than a public school, unfortunately. So they're not Shomer Shabbat because they think they don't have to be Shomer Shabbat. So that's a Tinok Sheni Shabbat. It's a different story. But the regular non-frum person, right? I hope no one went to Sinai over here. I call it Bitakise. So I don't know if I can say it. They tried their best, but the question is not just limited to Shomer Shabbat. Moshe Feinstein says you have to make sure that the guy is a frum Jew to count them for a minyan. So Moshe famously writes, he says, well, where do we learn the whole concept of minyan? By extension, you learn it from Edahara, the bad congregation, who the Torah calls them basically Reshaim. So there are 10 Reshaim that Hashem calls them an Edah, and you learn from there that the minyan needs to be 10. So says Moshe Feinstein, based on that you could count even a less from Jew as, or non-from Jew as a minyan. Right, so that's again, of course, used a lot, especially for cases that there is a need, especially for kiruv operations and so on. But nevertheless, how far you could take that is already a machloket by itself of a person that is completely not Shomer Shabbat deliberately and so on. For instance, somebody that grew up from and so on now completely changed and is not keeping anything. So is that person considered Tinok Shenishba? That would be a little bit of a stretch. You would say, yeah, because of abuse and who knows what happened. His Rebbe was not like him. And how far you could stretch the concept of Tinok Shenishba, that's not his fault. That would be, of course, a fascinating topic for itself, and not for it's beyond the scope of this stuff. But nevertheless, no, a Kohen could go up to the Khan as long as he hasn't killed anyone. Well, the Birkat Kohanim is a separate mitzvah that he has. We don't need him for Birkat Kohanim necessarily. The question is if he could be the conduit of bracha, which is a totally different sugya. So, for instance, somebody that killed someone now becomes a whole fascinating topic if the killing was not deliberate. Chas v'shalom, it happened in an accident. He ran over someone in a driving accident, or a doctor that's a surgeon, and somebody died under his knife. So can he now, because a person that murdered, a Kohen that murdered, cannot be Noseh Kapav because of the pasuk we had 2 weeks ago in Haftarah, Yedechem damim aleu. Your hands are filled with blood. So how far you take that by accidental kill or by professional surgery, and if you're a brain surgeon and you're a Kohen, but the nature of the surgeries are that at some point some people die under your knife. So is that considered that you killed somebody? So that's that becomes more of fascinating modern time questions about Kohanim, which at some point we'll discuss it, not for now. Says the Gemara. So again, that's not so pashut. Not so pashut. At some point we have to discuss those questions. Or self-defense of any sort. The army could be that you're invading, could be that you're defending. That's those are all good questions. Says the Gemara. So let's read this again. We went through all the loops of how we got 10 from Nikdash B'toch Bnei Yisrael connected with the Mitoch Ha'edah Azot, and also that Ad Matai La'edah Hara by Meragelim. So says the Gemara. My mashma, the Tani Rabbanai Yahua the Rabbi Chia bar Abba Atya Toch Toch. We learn it from Toch Toch. Ktiv Hacha v'Niktashti b'toch Bnei Yisrael. Over here it says Niktashti b'toch Bnei Yisrael. Uchtiv Hatam, and there it says Yibadelu mitoch ha'edah hazot. By Adat Korach he says, separate yourselves from this Aidah. Ma lehalan asara, afkan asara. So how do you know that lehalan is asara? How do you know that we're talking about asara? Because of the comparison that we gave for Hibadelu mitoch ha'edah hara'azot versus mitoch ha'edah azot versus the Meragelim that it says edah hara'a as well. So says the Gemara. Udekule alma mihat mifsak lo pasik. Now we had this machloket over here of Rabbi Shlomo and Levi, others, but one thing everybody agrees, and that is you do not stop for answering Nakdishach. You do not stop for answering Modim. The whole question is, if I come to shul late and I see that Sibur already started, should I start my tefillah or should I not start my tefillah? So if I can start and finish before Nakdishach or before Modim, then you could start. If not, not. So you see from both of these, whether you hold like Nakdishach or Modim, doesn't make a difference. But both of them are saying the same thing. If you could start and finish before the Shaliach Tzibur gets to Modim, or according to Rabbi Shimon Levi, if you could start and finish before you get to Nakdishach, the Shaliach Tzibur gets to Nakdishach, then start. If not, don't start. Which means clearly that you cannot say Naktishach or Modim in the middle of your tefillah. You can't pause in the middle of your tefillah, because if you could pause and answer Naktishach, if you could pause and answer Modim, so what's the problem? Start. Why do you say don't start if you can't start and finish? Say no, start. And when the Shalach Tzibur gets to Naktishach, pause your tefillah and answer Naktishach. Pause your tefillah and answer Modim. So you see clearly that regardless of which mandamar you hold like, both of them say you cannot pause tefillah for answering Naktishach. If you're in the middle of your tefillah and Shalach Tzibur starts saying Naktishach, what do? Nothing. Even halachically speaking, what do? Nothing. You just pause your tefillah. If he is a proper Shaliach Tzibur should know halachot of Shaliach Tzibur. One of the halachot of Shaliach Tzibur is when you do something that is considered devarim shebikdusha, a function of a tzibur, you have to have other people in mind. When you say Amen Yeshem Rabbah, and you see there are some people, you say, let's say Tit Kabal, after the tefillah. I see some people are still davening. They can't answer for whatever reason it is. So Shaliach Tzibur has to have them in mind that they should be Shomea Ke'oneh, as we mentioned the concept of Shomea Ke'oneh yesterday. So you have them in mind that you're saying Amen Yeshem Rabbah should be considered as they're saying. Or when you say Naktishach as the Shaliach Tzibur, you have to have in mind that those people who are davening b'kavanah a longer tefillah, or Rahman al-Litzlan, they came late and they davened, started tefillah late, you should have them in mind, and they just pause. They're not going to say a word. They're just going to pause and have in mind to be Yotzeh with the Shaliach Tzibur. Shaliach Tzibur also should have them in mind, and that's the halacha. But you don't pause and stop to say Naktishach. You don't pause, stop to say Modim. You can't. So says the Gemara, according to everybody, you're not stopping the tefillah to say Modim, to say Naktishach. In the Bet Midrash, they had a question. Mahu lehafsik leyeheh shemeh hagadol mevorach. How about stopping the tefillah to answer Yeshem Rabbah? In other words, the Gemara clearly is indicating that when you have Naktishach and Amen Yeshem Rabbah, which one is more important? Yeshem Rabbah. What's the halacha? Halachically speaking, which one is more important? Yeshem Rabbah. If you ask 10 people, all 10 probably will tell you that Naktishach is more important, right? No. Amen Yeshem Rabbah is tremendous. Is more important answering Amen Yeshem Rabbah than even Naktishach.
All the amens or just amen?
No, the answering of Yeheh Shemer Rabbah Mevorach La'alamu L'Mei Alvaya and Yitbarach, yes, no, that's machloket what exactly the text is. That's the minimum, and then of course the Ashkenazim answer only that. The Sfaradim answer 28 words, not 28 letters, so that you have a longer say. So says the Gemara. That was the question in the Gemara. You pause to say Amen Yeshem Rabbah. That's the most important thing you got. More important than Naktishach, more important than Modim. Kiata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, Amar Rav Yehuda. He said in the name of Rav Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, the Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan. In other words, this is not the regular Rabbi Yehuda or Rav Yehuda. This is not the regular Rabbi Shimon. These are Amoraim. The regular Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon are Tanaim. This is the students of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was the first generation of Amoraim. So these are the second generation Amoraim. They said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, Talmidi the Rabbi Yochanan, the students of Rabbi Yochanan, Amri lechol ein mafsikin chutz min yesh me'agadol mevorach. For nothing you will stop, aside from Yeshem Rabbah Mevorach. For Yeshem Rabbah Mevorach, you stop and you answer. Now, that's not the halacha. Okay? Says the Gemara, Shafilu osek b'maaseh merkava, that even if you are learning the deepest secrets of Torah, the highest levels of Torah, which we call maaseh merkava, which is the secrets of how the world runs, how the chariot of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, and so on, even if you're learning that, and someone says Kaddish, you stop And he answered, Yeshem Rabbi Morach. Velet hilchata kivateh. And the Gemara ends up saying, don't get too excited. It's not the halacha. You do not stop for. It's so important when you're omed bifnei melech, when you're standing in tefillah in front of Hashem, you stop for nothing. And again, the morale of this is you're standing in front of Hashem. You got to have derech eretz for it. You have to have mindfulness of I'm standing. I'm not pausing for anything. Even for Kavod of Hashem itself, which is the greatest single praise, still I'm not stopping for that because I'm standing to talk with HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
I thought we said for Kedusha, not Tisha.
You don't. If you're in the middle of tefillah, that's why the Gemara.
No,
You're listening is a different story. You can't pause to say.
Oh, actually,
To utter the words, you cannot. So says the Gemara, two dots. Rabbi Yehuda Omar. So this is now. Let us say that this is going to be now a whole discussion going into the next half of the continuation of Baal Keri that we spoke about yesterday, of someone that is Tameh because of Baal Keri, what he could do, what he can't do. The Gemara is going to challenge what we said yesterday about the Baal Keri, and it's going to now become a whole discussion in the Gemara. So let's begin. Let's start this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer mevarech lifnehem ulacharehem. In the Mishnah we said that a Baal Keri meharher belibo ve'eno mevarech. He says Shema in his mind, in his hirhur, not uttering the words of Shema, and he doesn't say the brachot of Shema even in his mind. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda at the end of Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda Omer mevarech lifnehem ulacharehem. Not only he says Shema, but he also says the brachot of Shema. That was Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara is going to challenge his way. Rabbi Yehuda does not believe in Baal Keri not being able to say this stuff. What does he exactly hold, Rabbi Yehuda? Says the Gemara, Lememra de Kasavar, Rabbi Yehuda Baal Keri mutar b'divrei Torah. You want to suggest that Rabbi Yehuda holds a Baal Keri could learn Torah? Shenemar, v'hamar Rabbi Yosha ben Levi. Don't we learn that Rabbi Yosha ben Levi said, Minay leBaal Keri she'asur b'divrei Torah? It's a pasuk. How do you know that Baal Keri cannot learn Torah? Because the pasuk says, "V'hodatam levanecha v'nivnei banecha." We just had this, that you should tell your children and your children's children, Yom Asher amata lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev, about the day that you stood in front of Har Sinai in Har HaChorev. So says the Gemara, it's a juxtaposition of two concepts next to each other. On one hand, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, which is v'hodatam levanecha v'livnei banecha, and it juxtaposes to that Yom Asher amata lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev, the day that you stood on Har Sinai to take the Torah. So says the Gemara, just like by Matan Torah on Har Sinai, a Baal Keri was asur. Hashem said to them clearly, stay away from becoming Keri. Afkan Baal Kerin asurin. Here also, for teaching and learning Torah, a Baal Keri is asur. So says Rabbi Yosha ben Levi. And says the Gemara, this is a smichut that you learn from the psukim. Now the Gemara is going to go through a fascinating discussion of whether or not everyone agrees that you darshin semuchim. In other words, what did the Gemara just do? Gemara said, when you have two psukim, two concepts juxtaposed by the Torah itself together, it's coming to teach you a halacha. But does everyone agree with this? We will see tomorrow that Rabbi Yehuda actually does not agree with this. It's not a concept that is universally agreed upon by everyone. And therefore, the Gemara is going to challenge it and also say that Rabbi Yehuda perhaps does agree with the Deuteronomy part of this, that anything that's mentioned in Devarim, you do darshin smichut, and what the difference between that is going to be a fascinating talk B'ezrat Hashem for tomorrow morning. Chazak u'baruch.
Rabbi, isn't that one of the reasons for a lot of the Shabbat halachot is that it's next to